and it will also be sent to each of you via an email to make sure that you just have everything that you need. So going forward, let me go back here one more. Okay, the purpose of this orientation is kind of just what I said. It's really to make sure that you understand your obligations and responsibilities as a member of an SMPS chapter board. What this is not telling you how to manage your chapter. We've covered that in many webinars in the past. This is not about finance and administration. This is not about recruitment and retention and the details of all of those different types of programs. This program is geared toward you as an officer and director and what your legal responsibilities are. And then, of course, a part of this conversation is to make sure that we're sharing key information about SMPS with each and every one of you, and information that is important for you to know. The speakers today are George Constantine from Venable LLP. George Constantine is our legal counsel. I'm Tina Myers. I head up membership and chapter development and work with Mary Cruz, the Director of Chapter Services here. Mary Cruz and I will both be facilitating throughout this program, and we'll be answering any questions that we can. So I'm going to give this off to George Constantine at this point. And George, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with your first slide, and you just let me know when you want me to advance it.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tina, and thanks everyone for participating today. I'm not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time talking here. I know that's an issue that you guys have been bandying about for a while, and certainly one that I'd be happy to answer questions on. So feel free to raise your hands when you have them, and we'll address them whether by verbally or through the chat function. So briefly, I'm just going to just start off with a general discussion of the legal issues involved here, or actually more the factual issues, or what got us to this point, and then talk about the legal and tax issues, and conclude with some recommendations going forward. Again, not my intention is not to take a lot of time or make you all experts in the tax code and regulations when it applies to 501c6 organizations, but as leaders of chapters, you have a certain expectation that you're going to at least be able to, what we call in the legal field, issue spot, be able to pick out activities or potential problems that may arise that are from a legal perspective, not to solve them necessarily, but at least to identify where those areas might raise a concern. And we're talking specifically here about items related to this private inurement prohibition in the tax code. So let's move on to the next slide, Tina, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I know a lot of questions that have arisen, have to do with what chapter leaders, be it members of the board or officers of the board, what benefits can be provided to them in their role as chapter leaders, and we're talking about things like attending chapter activities, maybe attending activities put on by SMPS National, and whether those sorts of things can be essentially comped by the chapter in the event of chapter activities, or reimbursed in the event of an attendance at the national conference, for instance. And they're kind of, from a factual, just general impression standpoint, there are, I guess, competing issues that come into play when you think about this. I mean, first off, if we're paying for an individual to attend the meeting, or if we're not getting revenue from an individual who's supposed to be attending who's attending one of our chapter meetings, that hits on the kind of the point that the chapter has limited funds to begin with, and this doesn't kind of help the budget from that perspective. By the same token, kind of a competing influence here is, directors at the chapter level and directors of any nonprofit corporation like SMPS and its chapters are not getting compensated for what they do. We're being asked, as directors, we're being asked to spend a lot of time to do what we do, and we're being asked to, be very active participants and leaders in an organization where there's no compensation. So there is this competing interest of, we have limited funds, and it's difficult to expend them, and I understand that. Finally, another, I think, point to keep in mind as we talk about this is outside of the legal realm, but it's the general appearance issue. What does it look like to the rank and file members if directors get what they view as excessive, or maybe not even excessive, but where they view as unfair benefits because the members don't get them. So as I talk through this, those are kind of the points I'd like for you to keep in mind. But I think we're going to hit some recommendations that I would suggest in working with other associations and others in this area as to kind of maybe a common sense solution that addresses all of these issues in a way that's fair and beneficial to both the chapter and doesn't discourage participation at the board level. So next slide, please, Tina.
Okay.
All right. Well, apologies in advance if this is sort of a remedial review, and I know that some of the slides that follow mine will also touch on some of these issues, but I want to make sure we frame this right. And we're talking about the legal issues involved with chapter leaders, directors, officers, et cetera, receiving benefits from the chapter. And I think from the legal framework perspective, you have to remember that both SMPS and its chapters are recognized as exempt under Section 501c6 of the Internal Revenue Code. Well, what's 501c6? That's a section of the code that says we don't have to pay taxes on our net income. However, there are certain requirements in order to qualify for 501c6, not the least of which being as a 501c6 organization, we're supposed to be an association of members who have a like interest in a industry, profession, or line of business. So we are all professionals who work for or with professional services providers, and we work in the marketing arena. Therefore, we qualify as 501c6 organization, and so do our chapters. Another requirement, and more to the point, given what we're talking about today, another requirement under 501c6 is there not be something that's called private inurement. And we'll talk more in depth about what that is, and I know that you've heard enough about it already. It's not the most easily to intuit definitions, but essentially private inurement is unequal benefits or benefits flowing to insiders that they don't pay or give adequate compensation for. And again, I'll get into more detail there. I'm not going to belabor it now, but we'll get into some more detail as to what it means, at least in the eyes of the IRS. Outside of the tax code restrictions that come into play from a legal perspective is also the general fiduciary responsibilities of directors. And I know that Tina is going to talk a little bit more about this, but very briefly, the fiduciary responsibilities include, as a director of a nonprofit corporation, you owe a certain organization.
You're breaking up just a little bit.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry, but you were breaking up just a little bit. Could you start that over again?
Oh, sure. On the fiduciary duties front, or?
Yes, please. Fiduciary responsibilities.
Okay. So there are going to be a more in-depth discussion of the fiduciary responsibilities that Tina will provide at the second half of this presentation. But just for purposes of framing this from a legal perspective, know that there are fiduciary responsibilities of care and loyalty and obedience that each director owes to the chapter. And you owe this even though you may not be compensated and even though you may not receive any significant benefits. The duty of care means you operate or serve as a director in a way that you attend meetings, you read what's provided in advance, you ask questions as you receive them, you otherwise are engaged and make decisions based on kind of reasonable care and reasonable diligence. So you'll get a little more of this later, but the duty of loyalty as a director requires you legally to always act in the best interest of the corporation when you are acting as a director, and that means putting the corporation's interests above all others. And as we talk about some of these issues, I think I'm talking more about it from an appearance standpoint than an actual real kind of fiduciary duty risk standpoint. But when you think about the duty of loyalty and the duty to avoid conflicts of interest, as a director, sometimes there can be a conflict between, well, yeah, I'd like to go to this meeting, or I'd like to go to this event, or it would help my career if I were at more of these activities, but I can't pay for it. As a director, hey, I could vote for myself to get into this for free, so why not do it? Not too much of a stretch to implicate those fiduciary responsibilities as well. So it's something to keep an eye on. Look, this isn't the first organization. It certainly won't be the last that has kind of grappled with what benefits are too much or what benefits are just fine for directors. And I think as we get to this conclusion, you'll see my recommendation, it's always the same, is let's get a policy that's reasonable in place and let's follow it, and let's document the activities that we undertake that are implicated by the policy in a way that should any IRS person come knocking, we're squeaky clean, and should anyone else try to question the activities, that they can see a reasonable rule was established and it was followed. So that's kind of the legal and tax background. Moving on to the next slide, if you don't mind, Tina. And am I still breaking up, by the way?
No, you sound fine.
Okay, good. So let's go more specifically to private inurement. And this is a definition that comes straight from the Internal Revenue Service in one of their general counsel memos. What is private inurement? It's an expenditure of organizational funds that results in a benefit which is beyond the scope of benefits that would logically flow from the organization's performance of its exempt functions. It's a mouthful, I know, but essentially what it means is that an organization that's exempt under 501c6, any benefit that it receives from, say, registration fees or membership dues, et cetera, has to flow and go to the performance of its exempt mission and gets plowed back in. No one gets a dividend from a nonprofit corporation that's a 501c6. There's no owner of a 501c6 organization. So if we can move on to the next slide again, Tina. There's also no, under the requirements of the tax code and the regulations, any small amount of private inurement is enough to get an organization in trouble. And when I say in trouble, for a 501c6 organization, the only remedy that's available to the IRS in the event of a finding of private inurement is revocation of exempt status. Now again, I don't want to raise the specter of revocation necessarily. It is not very frequently that you will find the IRS actually revoking a 501c6 over inurement issues, but it's also an area of focus that the IRS has become increasingly focused on over the past, I would say, 5-6 years, largely with those in the community that are exempt under 501c3, your more traditional charities and direct service providers for charitable type activities or educational activities. But they have not ignored 501c6 organizations, and I've represented 501c6 organizations that have been audited by the IRS and have had certain transactions at least questioned at the outset under an inurement sort of theory. So the original concept and what got it into the tax code was this idea that a tax-exempt 501c6 organization cannot have owners, cannot have dividends. But since then, the IRS has gone more broadly and has interpreted this and enforced it in a way that it includes things like excessive compensation or the provision of benefits to usually an insider, meaning a director or a chief staff officer or a key employee, giving of benefits to these insiders without adequate compensation in return to the organization. Which kind of brings us to the point that we discussed earlier and the purpose for this call. The general rule or the general risk is if you're giving a director something for free, you're risking possible finding of inurement, particularly if there's a price for that others have to pay for. So just spoken on a big picture, broad scale, that's the concern we have. Now there are obviously in unique facts and circumstances, and there are issues to consider as we go through this, but that's the concern we want to avoid. This isn't a situation where it's kind of it's good to be the king or good to be the queen, and therefore I'm going to vote myself this or that. In fact, I can tell you we've had instances with clients that have had, particularly at the chapter level, where there's very little staff oversight. It's all volunteer run, where an individual chapter leader, elected leader, got hold of didn't get hold of, as part of the chapter processes, had access to a chapter credit card, and ran up a number of bills that appeared very much to be in payment for personal expenses. And the chapter was left with a depleted bank account. We're talking about a chapter that had, some, annual revenue of something like $10,000, a very small chapter, without enough resources to pay for someone to help them sue to get the money back. And it's just that sort of that's a real life example. That's not a specter that's out there. That's some possibility that's unlikely to happen in our world. So when we talk about private inurement issues, we're talking about one issue here that I think is a manageable issue that we're going to talk about. But if it's not managed and not if appropriate oversight isn't kind of generally paid to inurement issues, very quickly you create an environment where the sort of example that I just gave, where that can happen. So that's important to note. So I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Okay.
Thank you. So as I alluded to earlier, when it comes to this specific situation, what do we do about directors who may want to attend chapter events, or whom we may want to send to the national event? What can we do to encourage that without giving too significant a rise to the risk of private inurement? Well, the real key here is, when private inurement, from the last slide, the rule is you can't give directors something for free that others are charging for. Well, there may be situations where the benefit being provided by the director's presence there is significant and something that is worth giving a comp for. In other words, we are getting paid for the director's attendance at our event because we're requiring our director to speak at the event, to meet and greet at the event, to make sure that the registration is running smoothly. In other words, we have a business expectation and an actual chapter need to have someone in power at this event kind of running the show. And in those instances, it's perfectly acceptable to comp, as the term is, director activities if there's a valid business reason for doing it. But we need to do that, according to a policy and according to a regimented process, so that it isn't every director at every event, for instance, and it isn't the same director going to each event for free, for instance, or it isn't every director going to a national event for which their registration is comped. It needs to be done with some thought and pursuant to a policy. And I've drafted a very kind of skeletal draft policy to address just this. And then we'll move on to the next slide, please, Tina.
Sure.
And then the real key here is not just to have a policy where we recognize in individual situations that the directors are needed to attend this event and are, there's a business reason for doing that at the outset. That should be identified by the board and specifically kind of documented. Who's going to attend this event, and why do we need them here, and there be some form of either through minutes or some form of documentation, even a notation by the officer for a file that stays with the organization. But then a follow-up report after the fact would be very important in those situations, and it can be brief. I mean, we're not trying to create busy work for directors, but for instance, if we have directors who are attending local chapter events to serve as someone who introduces a speaker, or someone who helps the registration process, or someone who is, out there to, meet new members, for instance. A report that the director did that, and a report of the director's impressions of what happened, if there's any kind of lessons learned from that, that would stay with the file. Obviously it helps from my perspective. I'm the lawyer here advising that we want to guard against inurement risks, so we have that document in the file. But more importantly, it helps from a chapter management perspective to show the other directors and the other leaders of the chapter what lessons may be learned from that event, what, how that speaker performed, for instance, whether there are registration processes that are a problem, et cetera, et cetera. It creates a continuum. It creates a kind of paper trail of of how to continuously improve whatever the event is. Similarly, and perhaps more importantly, if there is a agreement to send perhaps one director or leader, and I would recommend no more than one, to the SMPS National Conference from a chapter perspective, I think a very detailed report would be in order in that situation to come back and say, here's some of the key, takeaways, both from a chapter management perspective and also more generally from what our members of our chapter might benefit from in their own professions, and some kind of report along those lines. Not just to, again, not just to hide into a filing cabinet or hide into a file to protect against IRS scrutiny, but actually to improve the chapter's educational offerings, to perhaps improve its efficiencies, et cetera. So the key in going about this is to do it in a way that is pursuant to a policy that's approved by the board, and make sure that that policy is one that is wholly consistent with your tax-exempt mission and your purposes of being educational, and offering an opportunity for professionals in this industry to network and get together, and not have it be one that is a perk of the office, for instance. And I think that not only protects the organization from a legal and tax standpoint, it also helps from the impression standpoint that I discussed earlier. We don't want to unduly punish or obligate directors to expend their personal funds or their company funds on numerous chapter events. But by the same token, we also don't want to give kind of the rank and file members the impression that, chapter leadership carries with it certain, perks that in the eyes of those members is, unfair. So I think maybe I have one more slide.
Well, actually, before you go, there is a question, George. Yep. Someone is asking, who is responsible to maintain these reports? Who saves them, and are they to be submitted to National?
Well, on the first 2 points, each chapter, I know that the chapters largely don't have employees. Each chapter should have a file that stays with the officers and travels to whichever officer takes charge of the secretary and chair positions, and I think those reports should stay with them, and be part of those files so they don't get misplaced or lost. I don't know from an internal perspective how SMPS National kind of helps with that document maintenance, but it may very well be that you do a certain amount of maintenance at the national level that you can assist with in keeping there as well.
Sure. I mean, and for the person who asked that question, this would be a great place for you to start using the archives and the library on My SMPS. Many of you are already using the chapter group and your library to store budgets and other documents in business of the chapter. So I think that would be a really great place for you to start storing those as well. Would you see any problem with that, George?
No, that's a good opportunity for maintaining a certain continuity as people move through the chairs.
Sure. Well, and another question that's being asked with the same. Yes.
I was just going to say I've got Elizabeth McCullen has her hand raised, and I've unmuted you, Elizabeth, if you want to ask your question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm with the Maryland chapter, and we are actually in the final draft stages of our policies and procedures manual. So that's where we have noted that, based on funding availability, that the president, current president, and possibly president-elect can receive a stipend to attend Build Business. So that is where we're documenting it, and then you're recommending that we have some kind of reporting that we file after the event just to kind of justify why that person got to go and the chapter paid for it.
Correct. Yes. And
would it be a summary of the event, or a benefits received to the chapter, a combo of both?
My thought would be, at a minimum, it's a summary of the event that gets shared with the rest of the board, and that perhaps it becomes without stepping on toes, because I know I don't want to introduce problems with almost kind of competing with a national program, but almost, it could be the subject of a next networking event, brief discussion. Those of you who couldn't make it, here's some of the things I've picked up from our visit.
Okay, so it's funny you say that because we're also trying to award a registration to the national conference to one of our members this year, and we're requiring that of them.
What are the bases for the award? This would be not a director?
Correct. It's for one of our members.
This would be separate and apart from the chapter leader attendance.
Correct.
What would be the criteria for qualifying to get that award?
We've put an application together that, well, first you have to have permission from your employer that, if you're awarded the scholarship that, they approve of you going and support it. And then it's just several questions about your professional career as well as your involvement in SMPS. And then the final requirement in the application and essay process is that you come up with an idea on how to kind of share the information you gathered with the rest of the chapter at our annual membership meeting in August.
So is that almost like a scholarship type of deal?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that's what we're referring to it as a Build Business Scholarship, which I know other chapters have.
Okay.
Right. The general approach with scholarships for 501c6 organizations is you need to apply criteria objectively and not limit the scope of people who could receive the scholarship to a very small group. Of course, the IRS never really tells us what they mean by that. But if it were, for instance, just the board and just a scholarship for the board, that would be too small a group. In fact, what we would recommend in this situation is that board members not qualify for that. That it be strictly, among the rank and file members. It manages risk that way on the private inurement front if it's more of a benefit to rank and file members.
And as we're finalizing the application and the process,
set of criteria
that's the issue we're running into. Should we open it up to board members?
Yeah, I would think, again, this is a risk management perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean that if board members are included that it's, a per se problem. But I think from a risk management perspective, I would normally recommend that our clients, keep it open only to members and not board members.
Okay.
All right.
And I do like the objective nature of the analysis, though. The criteria very much, are defensible criteria. This isn't, open, it isn't a very subjective process. It seems as though the application is going to require some, and I take it there would be a committee looking at this and, at least, 2-3 people at least deciding it, not just one person deciding who gets it.
Correct.
Yeah, and then the processes on deciding that, not to get too in the weeds here, should include attention to the conflict of interest concepts that Tina's going to talk about. In other words, if your coworker or, a relative or someone else is up for a scholarship and you're on the committee to select it, you've got to recuse yourself from that decision.
Mm-hmm.
George, do you have time for another question?
Sure.
Okay, and I think that we've covered this, but I just want to make sure that the question is addressed. There's a gentleman who says, we offer our current president and president-elect a stipend to attend national and regional events to represent the chapter. We allow the stipend to be used for any fees related to attending these meetings, including registration fees, travel expenses. Is this considered inurement?
I don't know that process is necessarily considered inurement, but you need to tie your benefit to the actual expense, and it shouldn't be a flat stipend. It should be a reimbursement of expenses that are documented, and that's for a number of reasons. From an accounting perspective, from a risk management perspective, to make sure it's not being misused. And just general good governance. It means if you're going to pay the expenses of someone to be there, and you find that there's a business reason to do that, and you find the amount you're going to pay is reasonable based on the benefit you're going to provide, you should only pay those expenses and not create a situation where someone could be incentivized to net out benefits through maybe, not attending this event or that event, or I'm raising some specters here that are more in the worst
Sure.
case, pile, but it's important. And again, that example I used was a real life example of a chapter leader who didn't have those sorts of oversight, protocols there. When you don't have those protocols, it just takes one bad actor to really cause trouble.
I don't see any other questions. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just have one more hand raised. I don't know if you have time.
That's fine.
Benjamin Sawa, I've unmuted you if you have a question. Benjamin?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So I do have one quick question.
Benjamin, you're breaking up. Is there anything in the background?
Can you hear me now?
It's very difficult to hear you.
Should I type in my question?
Go ahead. Go try.
How would that relate to personal expenses for directors? So the scenario that we often have is in the summertime, we go to these planning meetings attended by all the boards, directors, and we talk about your scholarship and stuff like that, etc. Oftentimes,
Tina, can you hear him?
I'm sorry, Benjamin?
yes.
I can't hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We're not hearing your question at all. There is something that's kind of garbling your call.
Okay, I'll type it
If you could go ahead and Benjamin and type it in, or send me your question, mary@smps.org. Just go ahead and type that in, and we'll get it answered for you. Okay,
I'm
go
so
ahead
sorry
on?
about that, Benjamin. Well, the only other question that I have, I don't see it on here, but I know that other chapters have asked me something like this. Up until the point we started talking about this particular issue, many of our chapters, some of the ways they're getting their volunteers is by saying, oh, well, we're going to do this for you. You'll be able to go to the conference or a certain event for free. And, of course, everyone's really sensitive and really taken all of this to heart. So that's great. But I think that one of the questions is, well, then, what can we do for them, to make sure that there's still a way to celebrate and do special for them? And so one example, and I wouldn't say that this is an issue, but George, we really need your perspective, is if they have just a celebration, they have an end-of-year party, but maybe it's just for the volunteers. It seems like there are always ways that you can do, thank your volunteers and to, just show that type of thing without having to give them what they wouldn't give members. So what is your thought on something like that?
Generally, I think that's a very low-risk area, particularly if it's a party and maybe what's there is a little bit of food and drink, but not any kind of tangible gifts. Where the concern lies is more if it's something that has a value beyond de minimis. When I say de minimis, I mean like there's a pin or something along those lines that you want to award your. That's what, I'm at a board meeting for another client, and they always give a pin to the departing chairman. So there's a perfect example. And I've never raised the concern, and I don't think it's worth raising because these people are giving freely of their time, and it may not even be that if you give something of value that it's per se inurement, but it creates a new obligation for you. You've got to actually of value. You may be in a 1099 territory. You may be in position of having to tell the individual that this is compensation for services you have rendered. But the run-of-the-mill sort of thing that I think every chapter at SMPS would like to do, or at least consider doing, it almost certainly is fine. Those sorts of benefits, like a party or end-of-year event, even if it's just the board, I'll leave you with a parting thought, which is probably something you've all heard before, but in the DC area we call it the Washington Post test. If you're going to throw a party, it's perfectly acceptable, but don't do it in a way that you wouldn't want to read about in the cover of the front page of your local newspaper. A reasonable event that doesn't involve all sorts of the terrible things that you've read about with some of those lavish corporate parties are fine, and I don't think you even need to do much by way of documentation. as directors, and you're going to talk about this, Tina, as directors, directors are stewards of the organization's resources.
Sure.
That's not to say that they, can't use it at all. You've got to encourage people to volunteer, and you've got to make them feel good, and you've got to make them work well with one another, and it's, for all those reasons, very reasonable to do that sort of thing.
Sure. George, I know that we've well gone over your time, and there are a couple more questions, but here's what I would like to do for those of you who've written a question and haven't had an answer. We have all of these captured and archived, and I will gladly forward these to George so you can have a direct response from him. I think some of them are items that we've already covered, but I'm sure you want to make certain that what you're doing as a chapter is appropriate and that it's specifically answered. And I promise you we will get to those questions. And I know it's important, and I appreciate the seriousness that all of our chapter leaders are giving this issue. So going forward, go to the next slide. And George, is there anything more that you'd like to add before we let you go?
No, Tina, just thanks to everyone for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come in after the fact. I include that link on the slide for those of you who may encounter questions from time to time running your chapter. We've got a number of articles on our website that are not heavy on citations and not big legal articles. They're more written for the association executive in mind. That may address some of the issues that you have questions about. So I include that just as an FYI.
That sounds great. We'll make sure that it's shared.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Okay, well, thank you so much, George. We really appreciate your time.
Okay, have a good day.
You too. Okay, as I said, we clearly have more questions that are specifically related to what you're doing and what your practices are at the chapter level. And some of them are even questions that I might have for George too. So once we wrap this session up, we'll get those questions to George and we'll make sure that he's able to answer them for you. So just want to make sure that you understand that it's not lost out there. So that said, there are few more slides here. We are expected to end around 3:15. I think we're going to be fine in our time, but if not, I will certainly make sure that you get a recap and a copy of any of the other slides at the end of this session. So going forward, what you need to know in understanding the responsibilities of your position as a chapter board member, as an officer, or as a director. You need to know what your fiduciary legal responsibilities are. You need to know and understand entirely what SMPS's mission is and vision is, but you also truly need to understand what that means in relationship with your chapter as well. You need to understand the relationship between SMPS headquarters and your chapter, the expectations of an SMPS chapter board member, and the resources available to you. George talked about the fiduciary legal responsibilities of nonprofit boards, and this is for for-profit boards as well. The duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. In the next couple of slides, I actually give you a couple of examples and a way for you to look at this. But understand that these are legal responsibilities of every one of you sitting around the table. And I want to give you a sense of, even if you don't have this in front of you, keep these things in mind when you're making critical decisions for your chapter and the management of the business going forward. I give you a couple of examples here for duty of care. And much of this, just when you look at the word, it's just going to make sense overall. But it's very important that you keep all of these to heart when you're making decisions for your chapter. So, of course, duty of care, it's really about sound judgment. When you're making decisions for the for whatever you're doing for your chapter, is it in the best interest of the management of the chapter, of your members? Are you really doing the background work to get all the information you need to make the appropriate choices? It's due diligence and decision making and financial decision. And we're going to talk a little bit more about financials and reporting a little bit further. And George gave us a great example of some of the challenges you may have if you're not well aware of what's going on in the Treasury and what some board members may be doing without your knowledge. You also need to make sure that you are actively and meaningfully participating in your board meetings. So you may have individuals that are coming to your meetings, but they're not involved, and maybe they're just not paying attention, they're not participating. As a member of a board, wherever you are, it is expected that you're going to be at the table, you are going to be prepared, and you are going to engage in the conversations in the business of the chapter. That is very much a part of duty of care. When we talk about duty of loyalty, this is about avoiding conflicts of interest. This goes back into making sure that the issue of private inurement, that directly is about duty of loyalty. Avoid using your position or assets to result in inappropriate financial gain or benefit. And then, of course, duty of obedience. There are certain governing documents. There are certain things that you must do and you are obligated to fulfill. That is about the mission and the goals of the organization, and it is about the governing documents that you have. So let's talk about those governing documents and the tools of governance overall. And this by no means is an exhaustive list, but these are important documents, and you need to understand exactly what they mean to you. Your articles of incorporation, and I kind of put a little cheat behind every one of these so you have a sense of where those duties lie, but it has obedience behind here, because even though your articles of incorporation, probably a very short document, not a lot of information there, but ultimately that is the primary document of governance that you need to be in line with. And if you are conducting business that is not in line with your articles of incorporation, you can have that taken away from you. And so that is always going to be the first document that, even if you were in a situation in a court of law, that is going to be the first thing that they're making sure that you're abiding by. Then, of course, it is going to be your bylaws. Many of us have talked about bylaws. Many of you have changed bylaws, and you're looking at them going forward into the future. But you all are required to make sure you understand what's in them, you are familiar with them, and that you are conducting your operations accordingly. Now, some of them may be very outdated, and there may be some other issues going on there, and we can talk through that. And just so you know also, for those of you who have never talked about bylaws with us, you may not change your bylaws without us first taking a look at them and approving them. There are certain elements of your bylaws you may not change. You may not change the membership qualifications, you may not change the categories of membership, and all of those things are in the very front of your bylaws. But then there are other things that, as a chapter, are more appropriate and should be modified accordingly to what you need to do. But if you have any questions about that, you are always we're always welcome to ask us and help you through that, and we're already working with some chapters on that. Some other tools of governance and some documents that you really need to be paying attention to. Some of you have a strategic plan, some of you don't. But with your strategic plan, this is about duty of care. Are you being thoughtful about where you're going to into the future? Are you thinking about your membership and serving them well? Your strategic plan is going to be covering all of those types of elements, and that's where that duty comes into. Your affiliation agreement. Some of you may never have seen this. The affiliation agreement is the agreement between an SMPS chapter and SMPS headquarters. It is an agreement, and I'll talk about this just a little bit later, but just between us in terms of what we are going to do for you, and then in turn what you are going to do for us. It's a reciprocal understanding of how we're going to operate and support one another. Of course, your budget. This is, again, about duty of care and being really thoughtful and very considerate of the money that you have been entrusted to take care of. Your budget is basically a plan, and it's a very important document under all of these tools. Some of you might have a conflict of interest. That is about your duty of loyalty. If you are ever in a situation, it doesn't mean that you cannot do these things, but if you are in a situation sitting around your board, and maybe and we've actually had this, I think, as a little thing at PLS a couple of years ago, where there was an example of people sitting around the board table, and someone is saying, oh, well, I have this educational program I need to put on, and my brother does all this work, and he really needs the money, and we're going to give the business to him. Well, of course, there's a certain conflict of interest there, and those are the type of things that you need to avoid. However, you still may have a very valid, just in this specific instance, an example, a very valid person that is close to you that might do a really good job. But the whole point here is to make sure that that is fully disclosed to the board. The board has voted upon it without you being a part of that conversation. You dismiss yourself. And there's no pressure to feel that they have to go any one way. Sometimes those things just happen, and that's only one small example, but is one of those things that you may actually come across. And then, of course, your policies and procedures. Again, this is about duty of care. Most all of you, if you don't have policies and procedures, we need to start helping you and working on setting up some. Your policies and procedures, those are the documents that are really going to help you change and modify the way you manage your operations from year to year without having to change anything in your bylaws, which is why we often say we don't want you to change your bylaws. We don't want you to give it, put details and, all kinds of information in there. That's where the policies and procedures come into place. So these are important documents. And again, it's not all of them, but these are all that you should be familiar with. So under your fiduciary legal responsibilities, we're going to talk about just a couple of things. And some of you may be well aware of this, and some of you may not. But all of us, regardless of the roles we have, need to be very considerate and thoughtful about antitrust laws. And there are several out there. But antitrust laws, and you can read this as well as I can read it to you, but this is about making sure that there's, competition and there are no conspiracies, and this is about truly, making sure that there are no unfair practices here. So when we think about antitrust laws, and specifically, I want to talk about certification, but some things that, these are, that would include items that you need to be very careful about are membership restrictions, standard setting. Many associations and nonprofits in the past, especially scientific associations, were very involved in standard setting, and they have gotten out of that. Certification and self-regulation, information exchange programs where it's an elite group of people and no one else can get into that conversation. Now, let's talk about certification and self-regulation just a little bit, and specifically certification. On a couple of occasions, not many, I have had chapters ask me, well, with the CPSM, it should only be members, and no one else should be able to get their certification. Well, that would be an antitrust violation because it could give those individuals a heads up where it wasn't a fair competitive marketplace. So any group that you work with, a nonprofit organization, whether it's or other credentialing organizations, they were never going to require, unless there's a true exception, that you have to be a member of that organization. So if any of you ever had that question and why you don't need to be a member to become certified, that's the issue that comes in hand. Now, again, many of you are well aware and have seen this over and over again, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to make sure these things are always in front of you. It is imperative that you understand SMPS and you understand its vision and its mission. Now, the mission to advocate for, educate, and connect leaders in the building industry, that is something all of you should have as your mission. However, we also know that with the mission and vision, many of you have had your own strategic planning sessions, your own meetings where you've wanted to modify, or it's very different than what you see in front of you. So what we ask is, especially for the vision part of it, it doesn't have to be word for word verbatim, but we ask that you be as in line with our vision as possible. And as a matter of fact, for those of you who are going to be, and hopefully more of you that haven't in the past, will be submitting for the Striving for Excellence award program, this is going to be a new part of that. In just making sure that we're all in line and we all have the same goals in front of us. And again, the vision for a chapter, you might want to expand on that. And I know a couple of chapters have, and that's perfectly appropriate. But overall, the mission for all of us should very much be very simple and the same, and it makes your life easy as well. If any of you have questions on that, please don't hesitate to give us a call at the office. It is not mandatory, but really this is the best practice for you to take on. And we're going to be sharing more information about that with you in the future. Now, I'm not going to go into too much information about in terms of advocate, educate, and connect. But with advocate, I do want to talk to you a little bit. When we talk about advocate, we are talking about advocating for the profession, for marketing and business development, and all that goes with that. When we talk about advocate, we are not talking about a lobbying effort. We are not talking about a presence on the Hill. And it's important that you know that because, again, often as a chapter and as leaders, you might have individuals come up to you and say that they want a certain kind of support. Maybe it's for a party, maybe it's for a certain bill that's in place, and there's all kinds of ways that people might approach you. But it is inappropriate for SMPS to take on any stand in either direction. And really, that's not because we can't do it. As a 501c6 organization, we absolutely can have a lobbying effort, but that's not our directive. Our directive, and if you just read what's in orange in front of you, the IRS states that the effort must be related to the organization's exempt purpose. Our exempt purpose and our articles of incorporation state that we are here to promote the professional and educational advancement of the persons engaged, etc. We shall operate not for profit, but exclusively for charitable, scientific, literary, or educational purposes. There is no lobbying in any of that, and there is no language in there that would make you believe that lobbying is appropriate for SMPS. And it's important that we understand this because we are a professional, individual society. Our membership are professionals and individuals, and they come from all different perspectives, whether it's from their firm they represent or from their personal beliefs. And when they join this organization, they have every reason to believe that there is no political agenda. And to make sure that we are serving our members well, we need to be true to the purpose of the organization. So if you ever find yourself in a position as a chapter where people are coming up to you and they really want you to participate in supporting, certain legislation, there are other organizations that you might want to be involved with. There are sister organizations. They have lots and a major presence on the Hill, but and those would be good to go to. However, SMPS is not one of them. Of course, we have responsibilities to educate and to connect. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. Many of you already know this, but again, it's important to always have it in front of you because this is something all of us are responsible for in working with SMPS. Now, in talking about expectations, these are expectations as a member of the board, of a chapter board. You just need to make sure that these are fully understood and you're taking these things to heart. So please understand that you need to understand and you need to abide by the vision and mission, the bylaws, policies, and procedures. Those are your governing documents. That is where your duty of obedience comes in, and this is what your membership expects of you. That is a responsibility. It is a legal responsibility of yours. You need to make sure that you understand your chapter's financial position, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. You need to make sure that as a board, when you are meeting, you treat your information and discussions as confidential. Make sure that there is no gossip. You are speaking as one voice. And after your meeting, and maybe you have a very sensitive issue going on, that you're not having a meeting after the meeting with people who are not a part of that conversation, because it really puts the whole board in a precarious position, and it puts you in a position where you don't look professional. So as a board, even if you have a dissenting voice or a couple of dissenting voices, once you have met and you have agreed on a given course of action, you vote on it, you talk about it. If you don't agree with it, make sure your voice is heard at that meeting, but then once you agree and once you vote, it is done. And then you need to make sure that you are supporting one another. And that is a certain level of respect that every one of you deserve from one another. And you also need to make sure that you're promoting the society to others. You're promoting SMPS wherever you go. One of the things that is very difficult sometimes, because so many of you, you're good friends and You know, you have all kinds of different social events. But understand, and George talked about this a little bit, you are an agent of this organization. Whether you are a president of a chapter or you might be a programs chair, you might be a membership chair, regardless, you are director and you have the stamp of SMPS on you. And hopefully that's a really good thing. But what that means, too, is that you need to be sensitive to the things that you say. When you're using social networking, Facebook, LinkedIn, maybe Twitter, what are you saying? It's not just your friends who are seeing what you are posting out there. It is your colleagues, their other firms, their principals, people who have gone to your events. You'd be really thoughtful about not using profanity when you're on any of these social networks. Understand you can still have a personal presence, and that is perfectly fine because we are very much a social bunch, but you need to make sure that you still kind of have that little perspective in your head about who else is reading this. Is this something that I wouldn't want my firm principal to see, or someone else's firm principal to see? Because you may be surprised, and even if you think there are some things that are private, I think all of you know that this stuff is not so private. So just be very, very thoughtful about that. Make sure that you are current on the issues and trends affecting the society and its membership. You know, be thoughtful about what's going on in the industry overall. Make sure that you have a sense of what's going on in your local geographical area, and you know that way, of course, you can work and manage and operate your chapter accordingly. But it's important that you are well aware of that because, again, you're a leader of this organization. And make sure that you're always communicating with us at the national staff for anything that you need in any assistance that you need. We are here to always make sure that you are in the best position possible to succeed. We have a wealth of information. We're always trying to share it in lots of different ways, but sometimes it doesn't come across. If you think there's something that's out there and you just can't find it, we're just a call away. Your board meetings. You need to make sure, and this is about duty of care, you need to make sure you are attending your board meetings. If you are in a position and you find that you just cannot go to your board meetings, and many of you may not even realize this, but within your bylaws, there are provisions on several of them that if a member of a board doesn't attend 2 or more meetings, that is a reason to actually remove you from your board position. That's how important it is to be at those meetings. When you're at a meeting and you're a member of the board, you're expected to help making decisions. Decisions cannot be made unless their quorum is present, and a quorum is necessary to validate those actions of the board. So everything you have to offer, everything that you're thinking about has to be a part of that conversation. You need to be actively engaged. That is a part of your job as a member of the board of a chapter. Make sure that you're being respectful of everyone around you. Be on time and be prepared. Don't make people come, you're coming maybe a half hour later and then have to regroup and tell you everything that just happened. That's a part of what you need to do. Make sure that whoever is planning the meeting, typically this is going to be your president or maybe the secretary, make sure the materials, if they have to be read or you have a consent agenda, they're given in plenty of time for everyone to actually take a look at and to have a thoughtful conversation on. If the expectation is that you're there and you need to be active and you need to be involved in a meaningful conversation, it's very difficult to do that when you're reading materials as you get them that morning. Make sure you're reviewing the agenda to determine how you should prepare for the discussions. And some of you, I believe many of you are already using a consent agenda format. And rather go into the details of exactly how that works, I have an article on it from an older chapter leaders update. I'm happy to forward that to you. But a consent agenda is really going to help shorten many of your board meetings if you haven't already embraced it. It really takes away those detailed things that some of you just don't really need to talk about when you have some more strategy type of things that are more important. And then the chapter president is typically the person who needs to take care of the agenda. And the chapter president should make sure that, they're not just doing this alone either. Ask the other board members, is there something else that you want to have on the agenda, and just be courteous to make sure that everyone is captured there. And then, of course, on your agenda, always have an item at the end where you can talk about other new business for something that hasn't been captured when you were planning that meeting. So here's the thing I want to talk about with financials. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Every single one of you, and again, I don't care what your role is on the board, but you are absolutely responsible for the financial status of your chapter. And really what that means is you need to be knowledgeable. I mean, things happen, and together you need to make decisions to go forward. But the financial status you can find out through your statement of activities, a balance sheet, an income statement. If you don't call them that, there's all kinds of ways a treasurer can put together a report to give you the information that you need in making the right decisions and understanding exactly the position of your chapter at a given moment. And I'm going to tell you that I know that there are some treasurers out there, and some treasurers are on this call, that are really outstanding, and they are so diligent about giving information every month or at every board meeting. If your treasurer is not doing that, or if you're a treasurer and you're not doing that right now, that has to stop. You must make sure that your board, everyone around that table, has a full understanding of what is in the Treasury, what's coming in, what's going out, and what the status is. You need to demand the reports from the treasurer if you are not receiving them. This is a situation where if you're waiting 3, 4, 5 months and you still don't know what's going on, or you've asked for information and you're still not getting it, that's a red flag. And you need to be very thoughtful about that. All of you around the table must understand what is in your bank account, where your expenses and your liabilities lie, and your treasurer is the person who's responsible to get that information to you. And then you talk about that, together. If there is a challenging situation, well, then as a team, you're going to work that out. But you still must have that knowledge. If you have any questions or there are any challenges going on at a chapter level, call us at SMPS National. We will help you through whatever that issue is. But I have, in blue here, ignorance is not bliss. Just because you didn't know something was happening a couple of months ago, it doesn't mean that you are not held liable for some of the decisions that might have been made or where some of those funds have gone. Understand the fiduciary responsibility you have, and your members are trusting you to operate that chapter as effectively as you possibly can. So I just cannot emphasize the importance of this enough. So that said, I'm going to go forward. And I think I just have a few more minutes, but I promise this won't be too long. The relationship with SMPS and chapters. I could say so much about this, but these are some of the things that we don't talk about all the time, and I want to make sure that you're aware of them, and some of these things might be updated soon, and the affiliation agreement may be one of them. But the affiliation agreement, and I have a quick snapshot of it in front of you, is simply that agreement which every chartered chapter signs. Some of them are older because we hadn't have them updated, but I think 2010 is when we went ahead and we reviewed and changed up a few of these and sent them all out to the chapter's presidents and had them sign them. But ultimately what this is an agreement on how we are going to work together. This is what we are going to expect of you from an SMPS chapter. How, this can cover the location that you're going to serve, the members you're going to serve. It will cover the use of how we want you to use the logos and branding. It will cover a fiscal year. You're going to agree to go from September 1 through August and all those type of things. But also in this agreement, and if you haven't taken a look at it, take a look at it, is how we are going to help you too. This is what we're going to do to support you and make sure that you are a successful chapter. So this is a give and take. This is about us working together, but it's a very important document. It's not something that you're going to be able to modify and negotiate. This is just the standard protocol and what's in place. If you don't have your chapter affiliation agreement or you don't know where to find it and you want to take a look at it, just let me know. And I have a copy of every signed one on file, and I'm happy to just go ahead and send it off to you. Every single SMPS chapter must be chartered by the SMPS headquarters. Every one of our chapters, you do not have to worry about your own exemption. You are all under a group exemption. I will tell you right now that the IRS is looking and is thinking about modifying group exemptions and maybe even making it a little bit more difficult for that to happen. So we're going to be on top of that and making sure that there is not going to be any concern. But it is something that's kind of out there right now. Membership dues are collected through the headquarters. I know most of you are well aware of this. I just want to make sure, for those of you who might be new to the call, that you understand how this works. So when someone pays for their dues and membership in SMPS, it is for membership with the national organization as well with the chapter of their choice. If they didn't pick a chapter or put a name on there, we're going to select one based on a zip code. If for some reason it just doesn't work out, anytime any individual can change their chapter just by going online and just selecting, going through the list and selecting the chapter that they want to be with. It doesn't matter. You might ask for some reason be listed in Boston, but you do all kinds of work in California and you want to be affiliated with that chapter. That's okay. This is the choice of the individual member. SMPS also is responsible for all of the fulfillment efforts. The fulfillment efforts, that means, we are doing all the billing. We are reaching out to have people renew their memberships. We are reaching out to make sure that they have, reinstated if they've allowed their membership to drop. We have a very robust fulfillment effort, but we are responsible for all of that. What we ask from our chapters, though, and we try to give you the tools to make sure that you can do this, is to be aware of who's on the cusp of dropping in your membership. Look at them, and then because you probably know them personally, you have an opportunity sometimes the way we don't to call them and talk to them and find out what's going on. If you find that there are some unique situations, this is an individual who doesn't want to lose their membership, reach out to us here, and we will do our best to find a way to keep that individual involved, especially if you have a key volunteer and you're struggling with your volunteers. We're not going to let that membership just go. We're going to work with you together and find a way to get their future employer or the current employer to support them in the months ahead. Also, and this is on here because this was raised about a year ago. I thought it was understood, but sometimes these things aren't understood. But no chapter may charge any additional dues for membership. There was a chapter not long ago. It was just a general conversation. I think they even were thinking about a separate membership category and charging a certain amount of money just for those individuals, and it came to our attention. You cannot do that. The only groups that can do that, and this is only for nominal costs, and because of the way they are structured with the university, student chapters can certainly do that. We have some student chapters that have maybe $20 on top of the $25 student fee for SMPS overall. So that's the only exception. If for some reason you're having this odd conversation out there, please give us a call. I don't know what will be prompting it, but I just felt obligated to put that up there. The other things that are available to you, just to make sure, I know most of you are well aware of this, but again, we cannot emphasize this enough. The chapter management manual is updated every single year, and everyone on the staff is involved in updating the information and making sure that it is current. Many times you'll find that you have different questions, maybe about insurance or taxes, or maybe you have questions just about even maybe brand new to putting together a program. If you go through the chapter manual first, I think you will be amazed at all the questions that will be answered there. Oftentimes, you'll even find the staff will just look at the management manual just to make sure that we're saying exactly the way it needs to be, too. So this is a very thorough group of sections, hopefully covering everything that you really need. And one thing about the manual, we've been doing this for a long time now, and we're really trying to make it better and better. If you're finding that maybe there's something that you just always want but it's never covered in the manual, let us know. If there's something that needs to be included here, we are more than willing to modify it, make a new section, whatever it is that's going to be useful to you. That's what this tool is for. This year alone, to the 2011-12 manual, it's divided in sections. It was all reformatted, and if you click on the PDF, you can pull this from the My SMPS library under your chapter leader's library, and when you pull it up as a PDF, you'll find under the index there are links, hyperlinks to a lot of those models and samples or forms that are kind of discussed throughout the manual. So we hope that that's a really good tool for you to use this rather than just giving you copies and images of things when they're always updated, and sometimes just by the time it's printed, it's outdated. But we always try to make sure that that is current and then when it's updated in the library, that link is going to be, it's always going to go to that same link anyway, so you'll get the most recent information. So again, always looking for different ideas, but this is a really great set of manuals and tools for you. We always have, in supporting you with your IRS reporting, there was a message that just went out from me to all the presidents and treasurers to make sure that you're aware when the deadline is coming up, January 15th. We have the guide that just went out to all of you for the 990EZ and the 990N. The 990N is an electronic postcard, and many of you have already been giving me your copies from the IRS saying that you filed, which is really great. What you don't have in front of you, though, is a form and a guide for the 990. So far from what we have seen with the financial reporting, none of you qualify and have that many, that rate of revenue where you have to file the 990. But if you find that something's crazy and maybe you're there, give us a call, because it's a much longer form to fill out, but we can certainly help you with that if you find yourself in that position and we just didn't have the right information. If you need other IRS forms, the extension form 8868 or Schedules G and O, we have all that available to you as well, and that's made available in the Chapter Leaders Library. Of course, many of you, every single one of you should be well aware of my SMPS and the Chapter Leaders Library at this point. We have all kinds of models and samples. We have presentations. We have webinars. Our communications team is always updating the About SMPS, so if you're in a position where you need that kind of information, you can take it, you can modify it, do what you need to make it relevant to your program. And honestly, there's just so much more there, and many of you are sharing a lot of great information in that library too. So if you haven't looked at it in a while and you just didn't have time, try to find a little time. You might be surprised on how much information is there for you. Because there is so much that we really do. I just want to give you a snapshot of these sheets, and if you want more detail and how we can help you out, we put together these support sheets for regionals and for overall national chapter support. If there's something that's not on here, especially under support for chapters, but you just need you need us to help in a different way. Just because it's not written there doesn't mean that we can't help you with that. Again, we are here to make sure that all of you are successful and that you have the tools that you need to go forward and to learn and to train. So like I said, if you need anything, it's not here. All you need to do is give us a call. So with that said, I'm actually exactly 3:15. Mary, are there any questions? I haven't had a chance to really go through the list.
No, they were still questions lingering from the Inurement discussion,
Okay.
but no hands raised and no questions on this.
Okay, well, perfect. Then that ends our presentation. I cannot thank you enough for being a part of this. I know lots of you still have questions on private inurement. I promise you we will get to that. And beyond anything, I cannot thank you enough for the time that you give SMPS. We know it's hard. We know that you're doing this because you feel strongly about this organization, and we cannot be successful without you. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being a part of our program. That ends the presentation. Thank you.